Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on advancing women in private sector leadership, which is part of the OECD March on Gender series under the theme of empowering the recovery of through women's leadership. I'm Daniel Bluma, a senior policy analyst with the OECD Secretariat, who will be moderating today's session, and I'm pleased to have us get started with welcoming remarks from our Secretary General, Mr. Angel Gurria. Welcome, Angel.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Minister, distinguished speakers, friends. I'm delighted to join you today in the webinar on advancing women in private sector leadership in cooperation with the G20 Italian Presidency. Over the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the failures, the fractures, the fissures that have long existed in our societies and in our economies. It has laid bare the inherent gender inequalities of nearly every system in every part of the world, including social services, healthcare, employment, pay, leadership, share of unpaid work, access to finance. The COVID-19 crisis may also risk rolling back the already fragile gains made in advancing gender equality. Women are leaving the workforce in alarming numbers. By February 2021, across the OECD, 2% of employed women compared to 0.6% of employed men dropped out of the paid labor force. So almost, three and a half times more. Furthermore, according to a recent survey by McKinsey, more than 1 in 4 women are considering downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce, including those in leadership positions. In 2019, women represented only 23% of boards on average across OECD. And that included G20 countries. So only 23%, less than 0.25% on boards across OECD and G20 countries. And in 2020, only 7% of Fortune 500 companies were led by women. In the front line of the pandemic, although women make up 70% of the health workforce, they hold only 25% of senior roles. Now, the impact of COVID-19 on women's access to leadership is yet to be known, but concrete support measures are needed to mitigate any negative consequences, given the disproportionate impact of the crisis on women. In recent years, countries have implemented measures to increase diversity on boards and in senior management, but it's not enough. The OECD has been monitoring the delivery of the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. Now, according to the forthcoming OECD Corporate Governance Factbook, 60% of the jurisdictions that we looked at have established requirements to disclose gender composition of boards, while a majority of jurisdictions have also now established quotas or targets to encourage greater board diversity. The OECD applauds these measures and would insist that they continue in the recovery period. More must be done, however, to create an enabling and supportive environment for women. In particular, it is vital to include men in the conversation to challenge existing social norms. At the OECD, we have started an important project to access what we call restrictive masculinities through indicators to identify ways to involve men in the process of empowering women. Today, in many countries across the OECD, fathers account for less than 20% of those taking paid parental leave. Even if a system that promotes work-life balance is implemented, meaningful changes cannot happen unless we move away from deep-rooted social norms that confine men and women to traditional gender roles. It is important to recognize that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. Back in 2014, when the OECD helped design the G20 Brisbane gender target, so-called 25 for 25, G20 leaders recognized that gender equality and growth are inseparable. And today, more than ever, we need this narrative to help us move forward. The OECD is therefore proud to be supporting the Italian presidency in designing the, quote, G20 roadmap towards and beyond the Brisbane target to accelerate efforts in this direction. Now, the G20 Alliance for the Empowerment and Progression of Women's Economic Representation, otherwise called EMPOWER, could also unlock the barriers to women's leadership in the private sector by promoting collaboration between business leaders and, of course, governments on the other side of the table. So, dear friends, it is essential that countries put in place measures now to ensure that recovery framework include a gender perspective, and that the recovery plans aim to address the persistent gender inequalities in OECD and G20 countries. The OECD is ready to continue working with you and for you on this crucial issue and ensure a fair, inclusive, gender-balanced recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. And I am pleased now to be able to give the floor to our introductory speaker, Professor Elena Bonetti, who is the Minister for Equal Opportunities and Family in Italy. And we're particularly pleased because this comes out of the cooperation between the OECD and the G20 and the cooperation with the Italian presidency and working towards these objectives. And so with Minister Bonetti's support, we're pleased to be able to give the floor to Minister Bonetti. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Secretary General, dear speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly honored to take part in this event organized by the OECD, and I thank the Secretary General for the invitation to bring my contribution to the debate, also in close relation to the Italian G20 presidency for this year. Critical issues faced at the global level during the pandemic have confirmed the need for an even stronger commitment to address the different causes that produce gender gaps and make them structural. However, when we face the recovery challenge, we must not run the risk of returning to an obsolete narrative that brings growth with the increase in inequality and instability. Instead, we must seize the opportunity to make the restart an occasion for the true co-responsibility between women and men for the future of national and international communities. A co-responsibility that is chosen, planned, and implemented We must be aware of the relevance of women's and girls' conditions, especially in the educational field and in relation to opportunities for access to work and leadership in public and private sectors. In this context, in line with the relevant OECD guidelines and recommendations, Italy has already promoted a series of interventions and measures aimed at promoting gender equality, women's empowerment and leadership for effective and equal representation in public and private decision-making context. To this end, I've launched a roadmap towards an Italian national strategy for gender equality in line with the European strategy for gender equality. New ideas and proposals for social, cultural, and economic recovery in the post-pandemic era, including the need to increase the presence of women in all professions, to overcome barriers to career advancement, to counter stereotypes that limit female leadership, and to activate new energies and opportunities for women and men on equal terms. In this framework, it will be crucial to enhance successful models of female representation in leadership positions, especially in the business, with policies that take into account the double burden often carried by women, forcing them to choose between their personal and family life and professional career. We need the policies that promote effective social, educational, and care infrastructures and a fair distribution of unpaid care work between men and women in order to support work-life balance. On this last point, let me mention the comprehensive reform that I've proposed in Italy. The Family Act consists of a package of measures whose pillars are investment in women's work and parental leave. This is a complex intervention aimed at supporting parenthood and the social and educational role of families, at combating low birth rate and enhancing appropriate growth of girls, boys, and adolescents, and at promoting work-life balance, particularly for women, through tax deductions for care services and wider promotion of flexible work. Within the business sector, there is a well-established link between the underrepresentation of women in leadership positions and the real divergence in wages and salaries compared to men. Recalling the analysis carried out by OECD and published in the report Policies and Practices to Promote Women in Leadership Roles in Private Sectors, the rate of women in business models at all levels is associated with the introduction of quotas and their impact in the medium and long term. The report also refers to the direct impact of women in top positions on firms' financial performance and good corporate governance practices at the national and international level. In this sense, the Italian experience through the implementation of legislation on equal access to management and control bodies, first in listed companies and then in state-owned enterprises, has achieved encouraging results, jointly monitored by a special observatory commanded by the Department for Equal Opportunities, CONSOB, and the Bank of Italy. These results have led to a renewal of the legislation last year with an increased target of 40% rate of women in companies' boards. At the same time, measures to support female entrepreneurship have been strengthened, providing incentives for the development of enterprises with a majority of total female participation and guaranteeing better conditions of access to credit. Zero interest loans for women's micro and small enterprises and access to the equal opportunity section of the Guarantee Fund for small and medium enterprises, together with the actions for the dissemination of the entrepreneurial culture among women. We are fully aware today of how important it is to handle strongly the challenge of ensuring knowledge on women's empowerment and leadership in the public and the private sector. The OECD plays a fundamental role for data collection and analysis, with a view to increasing the participation of women in public life and in the labor market, so that they can truly influence and guide the recovery process involving all of us, especially in the post-pandemic. In this perspective, our country has assumed the G20 presidency for this year, whose agenda for the first time includes the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment as a cross-cutting topic to be specifically addressed at the Ministerial Conference on Women's Empowerment to be held the next August in Santa Margherita Ligure in the Liguria region. The conference will engage for the debate ministers for equal opportunities from the G20 and host countries, high-level representatives of international organizations, the business world, academia, and civil society. The outcomes of the conference will be collected by the presidency in order to bring them to the attention of the G20 leaders before the summit on October. The Ministerial Conference will address 4 specific areas on which the OECD has always worked and contributed to the release of significant reports and documents. First, STEM financial and digital education. Secondly, labor and economic empowerment, work-life balance, and finally, environment and sustainability. The Ministerial Conference aims to propose a rich discussion about common strategy involving the G20 actors. Indeed, G20 venue is a unique opportunity to give a global dimensions to women's empowerment policies, and this was also recognized by the Executive Director of UN Women when I had the pleasure to invite her for a dedicated event organized by Italy during the last Commission on the Status of Women in March this year. We are working in close coordination with the representatives of Empower, the initiative of the G20 leaders for the promotion of women's leadership, and with the Women 20 Engagement Group. Moreover, our action is also focused on the use of key indicators and the identification of conditions that enable the continuous feed of female talent. In my opinion, we should have a vision that puts women at the center of our common efforts for an effective post-pandemic social, cultural, and economic recovery, with all the actors involved, governments, civil society, and economic civil business, and with the support of organizations such as the OECD, whose experience at the global dimension is an important asset. We must seize this opportunity to define gender policies for women's empowerment and leadership in a renewed, joint and ambitious framework with clear objectives and appropriate tools to measure results. I thank you for your attention and I wish you all a successful debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Bonetti. And thank you to both to Secretary General and Minister Bonetti for opening this event. I'm not sure that you both can stay for the whole event. I understand, Minister Bonetti, you have to leave, but this already marks the importance of the cooperation between the G20 and the OECD and the Italian presidency, and the priorities that you've underlined gets us off to a very good start with this webinar, where we can now move to, we have lined up a panel of distinguished speakers, starting with Mathilde Mesnard, who is the Deputy Director of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs. She will be introducing the work that we have undertaken under the leadership of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee to prepare the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook, as well as the joint work that we've been carrying out with the G20 EMPOWER Alliance in developing this report on policies and practices to promote women in leadership roles in the private sector. So Mathilde will be our first speaker, and then we will move also to our other two panelists, Tsukiko Tsukahara, who is the Japanese co-representative of Empower and president of Kaleidist in Japan, and Gabriela Figueiredo Dias, who is the chair of the Portuguese Capital Markets Commission. So we will, after the initial presentation from Mathilde, we will try to move to a little bit more of an interactive format with questions and answers. But first, we give the floor to Mathilde to lay out the overall framework of this work on advancing women in private sector leadership that the OECD is undertaking. Thank you, Mathilde.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm very pleased to be with you today to present, as you said, Daniel, the findings of two things First, the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook on policies to promote gender diversity on boards and in senior management. And also, as you mentioned, Daniel, I will briefly present the report that we prepared for the G20 EMPOWER Alliance. So if somebody could put on the slides, thanks. So if you go to slides 2, Elodie, thank you. Perfect. Oops. So it's, as we all know, it's not only somehow a moral imperative to address gender inequality, it's also, there is also a very clear economic rationale for it, and especially, particularly in the current juncture, with the impact of the COVID-19, and as the SD and Minister Bonetti highlighted in their speeches. We all know that the female workforce represents a huge potential for economic growth, and this is this potential that the G20 recognized when it agreed to close the labor force participation gap by 25% by 2025. And this could increase annual growth by 0.2 to 0.6% points in all the G20 countries. So indeed, we have the data that supports the economic argument for gender diversity, and in particular, the economic argument for gender equality in the private sector. If we look at some data from Credit Suisse, data that covers more than 3,000 global companies, we see that more diverse boards translate into long-term value creation. For example, I will give you just 2 data points. Companies that have at least 1 female director, they generate on average 3.5% higher return on equity than those with no female director. So that's quite noticeable. And also companies who have more than 15% female senior managers have a 50% higher profitability than those with less than 10% female senior managers. So, I mean, these data should speak to all and should speak definitely to market participants. Go to next slide, please. So the OECD has developed several instruments to advance women's participation in the economy, including in leadership position. And one of them clearly is the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. And these principles include the recommendation to, and I'm quoting, saying that countries may wish to consider measures such as voluntary targets, disclosure requirements, boardroom quotas, and private initiatives that enhance gender diversity on board and in senior management. So you might have noticed that the may wish to consider is still kind of a prudent way of recommending something. This was written 6 years ago. So I think that now, if we would redraft this, it would be a little bit more forceful, like may recommend to directly, but we'll see, because we might engage in reviewing the principles. So we'll see what will be the next drafting. Next slide, please. So to monitor the implementation of these principles, we have a fact book that is published every 2 years since 2015, and that covers 50 OECD, G20, and FSB members. And the next edition this year will be published in June. And it provides comparative information in general on business and market landscape, on corporate governance frameworks, on shareholder rights, and on corporate board. And this edition of the fact book includes very new and very interesting information on the gender composition of boards and senior management, with data from 2017 to 2019. And this data will help us assess the impact and the effectiveness, more importantly, of policies that seek to promote gender diversity on boards. And this is quite important because studies show that gender diversity on boards has spillover effect on board dynamics and thus on the governance of companies, because gender diverse boards tend to have a wider range of backgrounds, experiences, perspectives, and problem-solving skills, which may contribute to better monitoring of executive behavior. So diverse boards, in a nutshell, they can counteract group thinking, and they help foster closer scrutiny of issues such as conflict of interest, but also ESG, corruption, and maybe also gender equality, if I may say so. So the fact book shows that there is a growing number of countries that are adopting measures to promote women's participation on boards and in senior management, as the SG said. And they do so often via disclosure requirements and regulatory measures such as quotas or voluntary targets. Go to slide 6, please, Elodie. So in terms of disclosure requirements, the number of countries that have established provisions to disclose gender composition of boards increased from 49% 4 years ago in 2017 to 60% in 2019. So we see a very clear and rapid increase in these provisions. Some countries also require or recommend disclosure of gender diversity policies, such as Hong Kong in China or Singapore. And requirements or recommendation to disclose the gender composition of senior management is far less common, because we can see that 70% of countries have provisions. However, what is very important to notice also is that there is a growing number of countries that require disclosure of gender pay gaps within firms. Let me give you a couple of examples here. In Australia, since 2012, firms with more than 100 employees have to disclose their gender equality indicators. In France, the same since 2018. Firms with more than 50 employees have to disclose gender equality index. And in Switzerland, firms with at least 100 employees have to carry out an internal wage equality analysis since 2018. So this I think it's very important, because this more information and transparency on the gender pay gaps is triggering a lot of scrutiny from the general public and market participants. If we go to slide 7, we see that in terms of provisions, also a quarter of the countries covered by the fact book, that means 24% of them, have adopted mandatory quotas. It's quite significant. And a slightly higher and growing share of countries, 30%, rely on voluntary targets or voluntary goals. So, and we have 8% of countries that have adopted both. And provisions applicable to boards of state-owned enterprise are generally more ambitious than those set for listed companies. And it's a little bit logic, because there the state can play the role of a good example, of champion. We have 5 countries regarding state-owned enterprise: Costa Rica, Finland, Iceland, Ireland, and Slovenia, that have set quotas at 40% or higher, compared to just 3 countries with these higher quotas for listed companies. And for listed companies, targets are generally set at a higher threshold than quotas. In 6 countries, targets are at 40% higher, while only 3 countries with quotas, France, Italy, and Norway, have quotas of at least 40% of women on boards. And what's interesting also is to look at the enforcement mechanisms, because it's good to have requirements, but it needs to be enforced. So 12 countries have adopted sanctions in case mandatory provisions are not achieved. And these sanctions may vary from, fines for non-compliant firms to firms being dissolved or banned from paying directors. So some of them are very serious about non-compliance. Slide 8, please. And in practice, women are more represented in senior management positions than on boards. That's the pipeline issue, And in 2019, on average, women comprise at least 1/3 of management positions in 44% of countries surveyed, while women comprise at least 1/3 of listed company boards in only 20% of countries. And at the other end of the spectrum in 2019, only 1 country had less than 15% of senior management occupied by women, whereas 18 countries had less than 15% of board positions occupied by women. So basically, there has been little progress over the last 3 years. This is the glass half full, I would say, but we still have a lot of work to do, and that's the half empty glass. So slide 9, please. So what's important to look at is the impact of quotas and the impact of targets. We see that listed companies in countries with mandatory quotas have attained greater overall gender diversity on boards, and that's quite logical, because on average, they have 27% of women on boards. It is more than in countries with only voluntary targets that have on average 23% of women on boards. And of course, it is even more than countries with no quotas or target in place that have only 90% of women on boards on average. So we see clearly that quotas can help increase the number of women on boards in the short term. That's important. We can look at the 3 countries that have mandatory quotas, like in France. France has increased from 13% of women on board in 2019 to 44% in 2019, from 2011 to 2019. In Germany, you have similar data with an increase from 16% of women on boards in 2011 to 33% in 2019. And if we look at Italy, as the minister was saying, we have increased the number of women on boards from 3% in 2009 to 37% in 2019. So you can see that the increase are quite significant and rapid. But interestingly, also the data shows that countries with no quotas or target have also recorded on average a higher average annual growth of women on boards between 17 and 19. Well, basically they are playing catch up. So it's a little bit normal that they grow more because they come from a lower basis. Next slide, please. So these results also suggest that other measures beside quotas and targets may play an important and a complementary role in promoting a more conducive environment for the advancement of women in leadership positions. And for instance, if we look at the US, shareholder engagement has been a very important force for change, despite the absence of country-level quotas or targets. We have only 1% of US companies covered by the 2019 MSCI index that had all male boards in 2019. If we look at Australia also, it has made significant progress by increasing the share of women on boards from just 8% in 2010 to 31% in 2019. And this without quota and without formally agreed target, but with complementary measures such as corporate governance principles and recommendations. We can see also that disclosure is a key tool to increase the impact of such measures by ensuring public scrutiny and market participants scrutiny. And this is becoming very important. Overall, countries that have adopted a range of approaches to address the underrepresentation of women on boards, they see progress. Countries have adopted a wide range of measures, and we see the progress achieved in countries with binding quotas. And of course, legislation, fines, and other sanctions can rapidly increase female participation on boards. But we can see also that voluntary targets can foster progress by stimulating bottom-up company initiative. And we have seen that in our numbers in the last 2 to 3 years. And we see that alternative and complementary measures are important. So that's where I will begin to present briefly to you the work that we have done for the G20 EMPOWER Alliance last year. We have done a report that was presented to the G20 last November, and that provides a typology of public-private and public-private initiatives, policies, and programs to help women reach leadership positions in the private sector. This is based on a survey in 20 countries and in the analysis of over 100 of initiatives. And this report is complemented by a Playbook of Practice, and it established a typology divided in 3 sections. The first section includes initiatives related to creating buy-in from companies to achieve gender equality and accelerate progress. The second section covers initiatives mainly implemented at company level that signal a commitment by company leadership to accelerate progress. And this includes the adoption of targets and metrics also diversity inclusion policies, or the revision and recruitment and promotion policies and processes. The third section relates to training, mentorship, and networking programs as private sector-led, government-led, or public-private instruments to support women's advancement to leadership positions. So we see, once again, that these complementary approaches are important, as we know that public policies are not sufficient by themselves to achieve gender diversity in private sector leadership. So the commitment and complementary practices of the private sector itself are key to bringing about change in culture, as it was mentioned by the SG, and change in practices that we all aim for. So as a final word, I wish to thank the G20 Italian Presidency and the EMPOWER Alliance for their important collaboration with the OECD, and our continued partnership, I'm very convinced, will help to build international consensus for monitoring and for encouraging further progress to promote the advancement of women in private sector leadership. With this, I give you back the floor, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathilde, for a very interesting presentation. And I should note that while the information that you've just presented is not yet public, the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook will be published very soon in June. And we have a list of all of the participants, and we'll send a link as soon as it becomes available, so that you will be able to access the more detailed information that Mathilde talked about beginning in June when the Factbook is published. And likewise for the last report that she mentioned on advancing women in leadership that we submitted to the G20 EMPOWER Alliance, that report is available online, and there's a link to it in the agenda for this event if you'd like to take a closer look at that. So moving to our other two speakers in the panel, we divided this between a public sector perspective from Gabriela Figueiredo Dias, the chairwoman of the Portuguese Capital Markets Commission, who is also the vice chair of the OECD's Corporate Governance Committee. So we're very pleased to have Gabriela here to tell us more about the experience of Portugal, which has been quite dynamic in its public policy side, in particular with the establishment of a quota for women serving on boards. It was 20% initially and moved recently to 1/3 of board members. So we're very interested to hear from you, Gabriela, how you've seen this experience, what have been the challenges, whether you see it as fully successful, or tell us a little bit the inside story if you could.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Mathilde, as well for this excellent presentation and for framing our interventions. It's indeed a pleasure to have the opportunity to participate in this webinar on advancing women in the private sector leadership. The policies and the policy initiatives and the incentives to bring more women to take leadership roles is indeed an important and pressing corporate governance topic and policy challenge, and so it is indeed an honor to me to be able to join you here today. As to your questions about the challenges and if in Portugal and if the initiatives taken have been successful, I'd say the challenges have been many and the success as well. Although we are still lagging behind other countries and still in the second half, so to speak, of the ranking in respect to the number of percentage of women in top leadership roles. It's been an impressive progress since in the last, I'd say, 4 years or something like that. Let me just say one word to the report that has been presented by Mathilde, which is also impressive, and it's a very valuable piece of work in assessing the current state of play of women's representation in the private sector, and as well of the range of the OECD policy instruments and recommendations, which are and will be extremely helpful and useful for the purpose, for this purpose. Also, the Corporate Governance Factbook, which is a deliverable of the Corporate Governance Committee that I have the honor to vice chair, is indeed a valuable instrument. And so I think that OECD is putting in place and delivering to all of us important, relevant tools and instruments to provide us with the appropriate contexts to develop on these gender issues. So this webinar is indeed taking place in a very special moment, like our Secretary General Angel Gurria and Mathilde have mentioned. It is already clear that the social and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women particularly hard for reasons that we all know, namely because they are generally more represented in some sectors that have been most or worst hit, but also because many of them are still the main responsible ones for child and family caring while struggling to keep their jobs and to keep up their productivity levels. So the current context may well represent a setback in the progress towards gender equality that it's been achieved so far. So this is indeed the right time to strengthen this debate, to reflect on the changes and on the challenges, like you mentioned, Daniel, that we have faced during the last year, and to do things differently. In Portugal, and going to your question, specifically to your question, we have already taken what I consider to be the first and important steps in this area. Even more important, given that until very recently, Portugal was lagging behind most, as I said, European countries in respect to gender diversity at the board and to the awareness of the very negative impacts of this gap. So having this starting point as a background, the steps taken and the developments already achieved are, in my perspective, successful and may serve as an example for other jurisdictions with similar situations of how it is possible to progress well and rapidly in this area and achieve the material results. In fact, in 2017, the Parliament approved a law imposing a balanced representation between men and women on the board of directors of listed companies and state-owned enterprises. The envisaged balanced representation is based on a setting up of a minimum quota of members of the underrepresented gender, which is applicable to each board and supervisory board. For listed companies, the law establishes a gradual level of compliance by companies' governing bodies, defining a progressive quota, like Daniel mentioned. After January 2018, the proportion of members of women could not be less than 20%, and this proportion increased to 1/3 after January 2020. The Portuguese Securities Commission that I have the honor to chair is responsible for supervising compliance with this regime by listed companies and for the application of gradual penalties foreseen in the law in case of non-compliance. Firstly, or the first sanction that we can apply is the public declaration of non-compliance and provisional nature of the appointment of the board. It's like a little bit naming and shaming and putting a little bit of pressure on the board. Then, in case the company does not get compliant within 3 months, a registered reprimand may be applied. And if the company fails to comply for a period over 1 year, a periodic penalty payment may be imposed. So it's a gradual system of penalties or sanctions that we can apply for to the companies which do not comply with quota. At this point in time, our overall assessment as a supervisor of the formal compliance of quota requirements by listed companies is positive. Most of them have committed to complying with these legal regimes, and in the residual cases of non-compliance, the harshest penalty applied so far was the declaration of non-compliance and provisional nature of the appointment, after which the non-compliant companies were able to fix the infringement. So, since 2018, the CMVM detected 15 situations of non-compliance, many of which have been fixed or are subject to a supervisory follow-up approach aimed at compelling the firms to comply voluntarily. So all in all, in respect to quota compliance or the formal compliance to the quota requirements, the results are positive, but we know that we still have, there is still a long way to go. We are not there yet. If we take the European ranking of countries in respect to the number of women in top management position, as I mentioned, Portugal is still in the second half of the ranking, though much better position than it was in 2017 when the quota requirements were set up. More importantly, we cannot take the quota compliance results for granted or as a sign or consequence of a solid structural evolution. These developments are, of course, very relevant and important, and quota will help and are already helping to change the picture. But we need more, and we are conscious that we need more. We need to ensure a friendly and favorable framework to increasing the percentage of women in top management positions. We have to build on the evolution achieved so far and work on culture and mentality, on meaningful and effective policies, and on a strong sense of purpose guiding the company's global approach to equality and diversity. In this regard, and in addition to the quota requirements, the Portuguese law also requires listed companies to prepare and disclose an annual plan for equality at the companies. This annual plan should work as an incentive for the firms to reflect periodically or on an ongoing basis about their gender practices and policies, somehow overcoming a possible check-in-the-box approach to the quota compliance, to the compliance with quota requirements, enlarging the scope of diversity within the firm governance, and progressively creating awareness of the positive impacts of gender diversity at the board. There are also some other rules in place regarding the disclosure of non-financial information and gender information, also focusing on the principle same job, same salary, which is subject to a recommendation to state-owned enterprises to disclose every 3 years men and women remunerations. So this set of rules and recommendations will helpfully contribute to create the needed awareness and a strong diversity culture among companies and their managers, their shareholders, and their stakeholders, going far beyond the mere duty to comply with quotas and leaving far behind the false tension between sustainability and profit. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. That's quite a rich range of different policies and aspects that you've brought out in terms of it's not just a question of a quota, but many supporting policies and actions taken. In particular, your point about changing also the management culture and mentality, I think is a question that Tsukiko, our next speaker, can speak to very much, because I think that's part of the main mission of the EMPOWER Alliance, is to work on that change in culture and mentality and advocate from a private sector perspective and through private-public sector cooperation in G20 countries and certain additional countries that are in EMPOWER. So I'd like to invite you, Tsukiko, if you could, to tell us a little bit about EMPOWER, and particularly because Japan, when it was chairing the G20 presidency, actually had the leadership in establishing the EMPOWER Alliance. And so I'm interested to hear from your perspective, what has been the impact in Japan and in the work that you do.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you very much for having me in this important occasion. The EMPOWER Alliance was clearly mentioned in the G20 Osaka Summit Leaders Declaration, which means establishing the EMPOWER Alliance was endorsed by all the G20 leaders, including Japan's Prime Minister at the time. And as Mathilde gave presentation, the case for women's empowerment is proven already. Women's empowerment towards leadership is critical for Japanese society, as we recognize we have a huge room for improvement going forward. And also is the business imperative to overcome this uncertain business environment under COVID-19 pandemic. As the private sector, the Japanese private sector representative of EMPOWER, believe that the framework of the EMPOWER Alliance is very effective because the leaders in the business sector as employers of women proactively participate as accountable stakeholders in women empowerment, learn from each other, and make progress with the action-driven mindset. We have established our Empower vision, which is be the most inclusive and action-driven alliance among business and governments to accelerate women's leadership and empowerment across the G20 countries. We think the Empower Alliance is unique and meaningful as stated in our vision. The Empower Alliance has two dimensions in its activities. One is the whole alliance-wide activities across the G20 countries, and the other is the local concrete activities with its committed advocates in each member country. In Japan, we put high priority to recruit good number and quality of advocates in our local community based on our agreement across Empower Alliance. We currently have 26 advocates, including major business associations such as Keidanren and Japan headquartered and global subsidiary companies. And we as the Empower private sector representatives, our advocates, and our government partners are closely co-working. One of our local activities, leveraging the alliance-wide activities, is to analyze the Empower good practices and identify key insights for Japanese organizations to help their implementation further. OECD has been a great partner since the launch, and it played a major role to collect our good practices across the G20 Empower member countries to analyze them and summarize into the report, which is perspective on policies and practices to promote women in leadership roles in the private sector in G20 countries, as mentioned by Mathilde last year. Japan submitted 16 good practices from the private sector and some other good practices from the government sector. And as a whole Empower Alliance, we collected more than 100 practices last year. OECD kindly structured the commonly observed issues and summarized the initiatives and practices by major category, as Mathilde just mentioned, which became an insightful report. We, as Japan's private sector representatives, analyzed by comparing Japan's practices and Empower member countries' practices based on the OECD analysis and identified some good opportunities for many organizations in Japan for further progresses. Therefore, the Empower Alliance and our good collaboration with OECD have been already providing positive impact in the business sector in Japan, I think. We highly appreciate our learnings from our collaboration, and Japan is leading good practice collection, update, and analysis this year again under the Italian presidency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsukiko. I have some follow-up questions I'd like to ask, but just to give a chance from the audience, I see that there have been a couple of follow-up questions there as well. We had a question for Gabriela, where they asked, in all this, what are you doing to actually monitor? Question was whether you have a monitoring process in place.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for the question, which is indeed important because it's having the rules is important, but monitoring the compliance with the rules and the evolution of the situation is as important as the rules. So I'd say that we have not one monitoring system, but more than one. Firstly, when I say we, I said the Portuguese Securities Commission. As I said, we are in charge of supervising the level of compliance with the rules by listed companies. And so it's a normal, regular supervisory process. So we monitor the annual meetings, the general annual meetings, the proposals for members to be elected to the board, if they comply with the gender rules or not. We approach the firms, if possible, before the AGM, if not possible, after the AGM to try to make them correct or fix any possible non-compliance, etc. And this is one monitoring process, and it's an ongoing process based not only on the proximity that we have to the listed companies, but also by checking and reviewing the annual reports that they are in charge to produce, namely the corporate governance report. But then we have some, private associations or institutions, self-regulatory institutions, which are all conducting very careful and detailed monitoring processes of the evolution of the situation. And this is also important. And thirdly, at the government level, and specifically for state-owned enterprises, the government is also in charge of monitoring and disclosing the situation on an annual basis. As I mentioned, there is also a rule which imposes state-owned enterprises to disclose remuneratory issues or men and women salaries to make sure that not only there is a progressive equality in terms of salaries, but also that this disclosure creates some awareness and pressure on them. So all in all, we have the public monitoring system by the regulator and by the government, and then we have private monitoring processes by self-regulatory and private associations which aim at monitoring the evolution.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to also come back to Mathilde, because in your presentation, you mentioned that there may be a possibility to revise the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance, that the Corporate Governance Committee is considering at the moment revising the principles, and that the recommendation on gender talks about that governments may consider targets or quotas or voluntary other measures such as disclosure. And I just thought, given the additional 6 years of experience that we have now and the research you've seen, do you have a view of how this recommendation might evolve or could evolve? Just speaking on a personal opinion, not as a formal position of the OECD, to tell us a little bit, what do you see as the relative merits of targets or quotas or other measures? But in just 2 or 3 minutes maximum, please, because we have time for other questions as well.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a question that we have been discussing internally a lot. And I used to be super strong on quotas, probably because I am French and I in mandatory legislation somehow. But I think, as you mentioned, no, and as we discussed in the whole panel, we have a lot of different ways of achieving the same goal. And here we can see definitely that one size does not fit all. And the measures that countries may choose will depend a lot on their, of course, on their legal framework, their political also, tradition, their cultural practices, etc. So in France, we might rely more on law than on good practice and soft measures than in other countries. So that's definitely a choice. We have seen, and I mentioned that already, that if you have binding quotas, yes, this can be highly effective in rapidly increasing female participation on boards. That's clear. And so maybe when progress is too slow or when progress is blocked, quotas could be a good solution. I say could be a good solution. And as we have seen in Italy, in Germany, in France, it has worked. It has worked well. But we have also seen since probably 2015 that voluntary targets can work also, and that they can foster progress by stimulating a more like bottom-up company initiative. So, and we have seen, for example, in the UK case, that is it has worked very well, where there was a 25% target initially set to be achieved by 2016, if I well remember. And later this target was revised to 33% for the 350 largest companies in the FTSE. And we have seen as a result also that the share of women on boards has more than doubled in a span of 8 years. So yes, targets can work very well also. The progress might be slightly slower, but it's more organic. So, I mean, there is pros and cons on all sides. We have a choice. Countries will choose depending on their own preferences, traditions, etc. And here we can see also that the corporate governance codes can play an important role. And it has been the case in the UK with the revision of the code in 2018. And here, I mean, maybe to refer to Kiko presentation, that the practice that are implemented by companies themselves to achieve these voluntary targets are crucial. And we have seen with our report for Empower that you have a very wide diversity of practices. You could have diversity and inclusion committees, you could have tailored hiring practices, you could have retention policies, processes, of course, mentoring, networking programs, etc. So I think, I've become much more balanced in my views on these. I used to be super pro quota. I'm still pro quotas because I do think that sometimes they are necessary to deblock things. But other approaches are working. But probably also they are working now that in some countries, quotas were implemented. So basically, what you can tell companies is, okay, we don't force you, we give you targets. Somehow do something, achieve, and that otherwise we could do as bad as the French and impose high quotas. So I think it's a whole conversation that is advancing. Quotas have been working. Probably the threat of quotas combined with voluntary targets and combined with a lot of proactiveness from companies themselves is like moving the dial all across countries. And because, as we have seen also in the US, where you don't have quotas, you don't have targets, but you have the market scrutiny. And it's a whole system that is moving, because somehow what was acceptable 5 years or 10 years ago is no more acceptable. So companies themselves know that they have to move, even if there is no trigger from the public, from the government, they have to move because it's no more acceptable not to have enough women on boards. And first, not only it's not no more acceptable, also it's very stupid, because we have more and more evidence that the advantage that it brings to in terms of diversity of experiences, etc., and the importance of avoiding group thinking in boards, what it brings positively to the functioning of boards, the dynamics of boards, thus to the governance of the companies is convincing by itself, I would say.
Thank you, Mathilde. And of course, Japan is one of those countries that has a target now. It's for one person on the board. But as Mathilde has just mentioned, the private sector role is so important, and what you're doing there. So I would like to ask if you could say a little bit more, I think, not only the focus on boards, but also in how different actions are being taken in Japan to address women in the management pipeline. So Kiko, please. And I understand you have a couple of slides you may want to show for this.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Mathilde. Yes, Japan is the country who is taking the voluntary target approach, and as well as corporate governance code. And also, our business sector is taking, lots of policies and practices. And I'd like to share a bit slides that I've mentioned in my previous words. We have good practice categories in the private sector that Mathilde mentioned in her presentation, based on the entire EMPOWER Alliance Good Practice Collection and OECD analysis on the left-hand side, while we have good practice collection from Japanese companies on the right-hand side. So I would say Japanese companies are making great effort in establishing major policies and practices, providing training, networking for women. But we also see some opportunities for further improvement and actual outcome for Japanese companies when we look at those, blank space where other empower communities may have good practices. So for example, Japanese company may have good opportunities for improvement in combating unconscious bias, not only by just in providing trainings, but also by introducing some systematic structural measures like, diversity, diversification of interview or evaluated panel, or introduction of a structured interview method like unconscious to combat unconscious bias type of thing. So this is our learning from our analysis last year, and we are trying to progress further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsukiko. And I see that we have some very good questions from the audience, but unfortunately we're just 5 minutes from the scheduled end of the webinar. So we need to move to our final speaker, Nicolas Pinot. So I would like to thank our three panelists, Mathilde Mesnard, Tsukiko Tsukahara, and Gabriela Figueroa Diaz, for a very interesting session on the practices in your countries and across the OECD and G20. And we move to our final speaker, Nicolas Pinot, who is the Sherpa of the OECD to the G7 and G20, to give us some final remarks to conclude our session today about the OECD G20 collaboration to promote advancement of women in leadership positions in the private sector. So thank you, Nicolas. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. Minister, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to deliver concluding remarks for this webinar on advancing women in private sector leadership. As much has already been said by the Secretary General, by Minister Bonetti, and the previous speakers, let me really focus my remarks on the G20 gender agenda proper. As was recalled by the Secretary General and by Mathilde 7 years ago in Brisbane, G20 leaders made a very concrete commitment towards gender equality. It was to reduce the gender gap in labor market participation by 25% by 2025, the so-called 25 by 25 target. And I remember at the time our colleagues from the Employment Directorate and from the Economics Department, they crunched the numbers, and they showed that, as Mathilde pointed out, this goal could bring 100 more million well-educated women into the workforce, delivering several dividends, so to speak, boosting productivity, mitigating the demographic impact of aging, increasing potential growth, and reducing poverty and inequality. Since then, the OECD, together with the ILO, has been working with the G20 presidencies, the successive presidencies, to help countries monitor their progress in achieving this sort of golden target. The joint OECD ILO Women at Work report, shared every year by the Secretary General with the G20 leaders, provides an update on progress, sometimes lack of progress, towards this target. So what do we see? Over the years, all G20 countries have made some progress towards the 25 by 25 targets. There have been good performers, be it in terms of levels or in terms of trends. There are also laggards, and the COVID crisis risks jeopardizing the progress that has been achieved so far. But even if the progress has not been as fast as we had hoped for 7 years ago, this 25 by 25 target and commitment remain a flagship objective of the G20. This is a great commitment, really, I mean, it's simple, it's catchy, it's easy to understand, and it's easy to track. This is really the kind of target that we love in the G20 because it focuses the minds, it sets both a direction and an horizon. The problem, and it's somehow the pitfall of success of this target, is that when you have such a target that is easy to grasp, it became, in fact, the entire G20 agenda, overshadowing other more qualitative aspects of the gender gaps, where progress by G20 countries had been much more limited than on the 25 by 25 commitment. There has been, in a way, too much attention on a single quantitative target and not enough emphasis on the issue of quality of women's participation in the job market. And actually, it took the German presidency in 2017 to devote more attention to the job quality dimension of gender inequality in the labor market, and in particular at the gender pay gap. And most importantly, this is Japan, which actually made quality aspects a priority with two angles. The first one was to address unpaid household work, which is largely and mostly shouldered by women. And the second aspect, indeed, was to tackle the underrepresentation of women in leadership position. And Japan, indeed, launched the EMPOWER initiative in 2019, and it's great to have Tsukiko with us today, an initiative which was inaugurated by Saudi Arabia last year. So since 2017, I would say the G20 has made a bit of progress in developing a more holistic view of its gender equality and women empowerment agendas, including by looking at women in leadership-related aspects. But as Mathilde, Gabriela, and Tsukiko have shown, the battle remains uphill, to quote the title of an OECD report on the subject, especially when it comes to women representation in leadership. And the SG at the start mentioned this striking figure: only 7% of Fortune 500 companies were led by women. And in all G20 countries, according to our Women at Work report, women account for less than half of all managerial jobs. In a few countries, this figure is as high as 40%, but in others, it's around 15 or even less than 50%. So we are still lacking from the G20 the kind of systematic approach on those aspects that has been so well materialized by the 25 by 25 target when it came to labor market participation. So we really need an additional push from the G20. So this is great, therefore, that under the G20 presidency of Italy, there is a renewed momentum with the gender roadmap to Brisbane and beyond, which will precisely broaden the focus of the G20 on labor market participation to include the issue of quality of work and equal opportunities in business activities. And as the Minister Bonetti outlined, the Italian presidency will also hold the first ever G20 high-level conference on women empowerment. This will set a very good example for future presidencies to follow, and it will really steer political momentum for consensus around concrete and bold actions on the leader's side to promote women empowerment. I'm also delighted to note the progress this year in developing the G20 EMPOWER Alliance, which is somehow flourishing under this Italian presidency. And also good to note that Indonesia has already announced its intention to pursue the initiatives, as EMPOWER really strives not only to advocate progress, but also to develop targets and accountability mechanisms to advance women progression in leadership roles. So we are confident that EMPOWER this year will produce meaningful private sector commitments and monitoring mechanisms towards women empowerment with government support and in connection with the new framework provided by this Brisbane roadmap, which the OECD is supporting. So the OECD will continue to provide the full weight of its data, research, analysis instruments when it comes to this revision of the corporate governance principles. And I want to finish by thanking all the speakers who have contributed to this, to the expertise and the insights today. And we look forward to this engagement and raising the level of ambition as we work towards the high-level events in August. So please continue to count on the OECD to advance this critical agenda. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for your supportive words and for the strong messages that you've delivered on this topic. I mean, clearly we've heard from all of our speakers about a range of policies that can work effectively, so we know what needs to be done. We just need to do it. I hope this session, this virtual webinar, has helped provide these insights to a wider audience. And I should note that we will make this webinar available on YouTube on the event site. There have been some questions in the Q&A about whether we can also make the presentations available. So with the permission of Sukiko and Mathilde, we will be happy to make those available to all of the participants, if not on the web itself. And potentially also written remarks, if we can get approval of our speakers for that as well. So we hope that this has been as interesting for all of you as it has been for me and for all of our speakers. I think that with that, we need to close because we've gone a little bit over the time, but thank you all for the very interesting discussion today and insights provided. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Goodbye to everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel and all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Oh, yes, indeed.